Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the last in our series of episodes recorded at the Regent Street Cinema in London. I'm talking to the geneticist and science writer Adam Rutherford about the film of Kazuo Ishiguro's novel, Never Let Me Go. The book, the film, are about cloning, they're about education, morality, mortality. Frankly, they are about the meaning of existence. As always, you are about to hear an episode that was recorded in front of an audience who have just watched the film. And we're very conscious that you have probably not just watched the film. You may never have seen the film. Some people may have read the book and not seen the film. Some may have seen the film and not read the book. The film is a relatively faithful reproduction of the book. The novel came out in 2005, the film version in 2010. It was directed by Mark Romanek. The screenplay is by Alex Garland, who was the screenwriter of the 28 Days, Weeks, Years Later sequence. He went on to be the director of Ex Machina, a film that we're going to talk about, not least because Adam Rutherford worked with Alex Garland on that film. The plot, in some ways, is relatively straightforward. This is a film about cloning, and it tells the story primarily of three people, human clones. They are called Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy, played respectively by Kerry Mulligan, Keira Knightley, and Andrew Garfield. And we discover relatively early on in the film, slightly later on in my memory in the book, that these people/clones, and at one point they're described as not quite human, have been created to be organ donors. Their job is, when they reach a certain age, which is relatively young, more or less in their 20s, to donate vital organs, because this is a world in which science has discovered a way those organs can be used to cure most deadly diseases for people who aren't clones. This is the story of these three lives, and we see the lives at three stages. One is at school, early on. All three of them go to a school called Hailsham, which is portrayed as a pretty conventional English boarding school, very conventional, but also a little odd, jarringly odd in places. We then see them more or less immediately after they've left school, late teens, early 20s, at a place called the Cottages, where they are waiting. That's all they're doing. They're waiting for what comes next and making decisions. Not many decisions to be made, but one is whether, before becoming a donor, any of them might become what's called a carer, who is someone who looks after other donors. And it turns out that Kathy, played by Kerry Mulligan, will become a carer. And then in the third harrowing stage of the film and the book, they become donors. They make what are called donations. And we discover, as they discover, that some of them will make one donation, most will make two or three. A few, a small number, might make more than that is, more organs given. But after that, they will complete. And completion in this story means death. It's the end of the road. For all of them, it's inevitable. They know it's coming. And they talk about it. In the third part of the film, their lives are more or less lived within the medical system, in hospitals, in what look like care homes. And we track these three lives from mysterious beginnings to inevitable end. That's the story, that is the arc that Adam and I are going to be talking about. There's probably only one other thing to say about this film, which is the setting. It is set between the 1970s and the 1990s in a very recognisable England, indeed the east of England, a lot of it in Norfolk. The setting is completely familiar to anyone who was alive then, who grew up then, as I did, as Adam did as well. There is something very eerie about this strange, mysterious, otherworldly story set in such a prosaic and familiar place. That is part of what we talk about, but we also talk about the big, big ideas in this film. Here's the conversation. Adam, I've seen that film a few times now. It's a while since I've read the book. I still can't decide what it's about. So, apart from anything else, I need help with that. I want to start by asking you, you're a scientist, you're a geneticist. Do you think of it in any sense as a work of science fiction?
I'm so glad you just said that about not knowing what it's about, because when I was thinking on the way in here, what am I going to say when he says, "What do you think that film was about?" And I came to the conclusion my answer was going to be, well, one, I don't know what it's about, and two, they don't have to be about anything.
Well,
Uh,
it's about a lot of
it's
things.
about a lot of things, yeah. So, in answer to the question about science fiction, you know how I feel about taxonomy because we did a whole program in the history of bad ideas about my resistance to classifying things in very discrete genres or types. And so my answer to that question is kind of I don't care because I don't think it matters what genre it fits into if it does indeed fit into a genre. I think that if this is science fiction, or it sometimes gets called speculative fiction, in order to distinguish itself from science fiction, which I think is a genre, and I may annoy a lot of people who might be interested in my output as a scientist, is a genre almost always categorized by bad writing. So good ideas, but bad writing. And this is obviously not bad writing. It's one of the great novels of the 21st century. And I think that the screenplay matches that. So the tightness of setting up the whole universe in two title cards, I think is appealing. And that's the point at which I lose interest in it being classified as science fiction and then enter the world of trying to work out what it is about.
So, those title cards are interesting. So, it begins with a statement that in the early 1950s, there was a big scientific breakthrough. And then rapidly things changed. And we were told that effectively diseases were abolished and life expectancy reached above 100. That's the whole setup that we're giving. And in many ways, that is a sci fi setup. What's so fascinating about it is we are then shown the society that resulted. And it is 1970s, 1980s Britain, if anything, a little bleaker. So I look at the film and I think, where are these people who are living to 100? So if you remember the scene in the cafe where they're ordering steak, egg, and chips, and we get little glimpses of the people in the cafe who are not donors. They're the people who live in this bleak seaside town. I think it's Cromer. Is it Cromer?
The beach is Holcomb.
Or is it Holcombe? Anyway, it's Norfolk.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And you look at the people at the other tables and you think, these beautiful people, Keira Knightley and the others, are giving up their organs for these other people who don't look in great shape. So what's going on? How does this society, I mean, it's fascinating and it's haunting, but how does this society work? How are we meant to conceive this world that's been created by this breakthrough?
Well, the problem is that I think of it as a dystopian film and a dystopian novel. And again, that's another genre which is problematic because it's so overused and so often the explanation of what caused the dystopia is fundamental to the narrative, and I find that quite tedious. Again, it's quite appealing to me that the dystopia exists, and it's so recognizably 1985 in East Anglia, which is I'm a bit younger than them, but that's where I'm from, and I recognized a lot of.
You're from Ipswich,
I'm
right?
from Ipswich, yeah. So, but I also went to a school that was a bit like Hailsham, as I think a lot of people our age, roughly our age, might have done. Those types of schools where they are stuck in the 1950s, and they are the last places where the British Empire still, where people still think that the Second World War is being fought, and that the central idea in it is it's the complicity of this class structure, which is so painful to watch because as you say, the people in the cafe look on at the donors, these young clones is I think it's what they are from a genetic point of view. And they look disdainful at them. And the very obviously working class men who deliver
Yeah.
packages to the cottages where they live as when they're in their 20s also look at them like they're freaks, that they are a class below working class. It feels a weird and problematic thing to say, but they're sub slaves. They're below slaves in a social hierarchy because they are complicit. They know they exist. They're fully compliant that their purpose in life is to die to serve people they will never meet, who regard them with absolute disdain. And yet their whole existence is that they are as human as any of us with all of the foibles of falling in love and doing art and expressing themselves. And God, it's tragic.
Sub-slave, as you say, and yet another of the oddities of this society is it's not a surveillance society, so they bump their wrists as they go in and out. They're being monitored in some way, but there's extraordinary license when they leave school and they go to the cottages. There seems to be no supervision. They have been created in order to remain healthy, but no one seems to be checking whether they are keeping themselves healthy. They're eating sandwiches and stuff. And yet, as you also say, they are completely compliant. So it's a compliance-based order rather than a surveillance-based order. What is their motivation? There's a really haunting bit towards the end when Tommy says of one of the people in his home that this boy was worried that he would complete on the first donation. And you don't know whether that was because he was worried that he would complete or he was worried he would let the side down by completing on his first donation. And it feels to me like it's the second. His fear was he would not be a good donor because he would only manage one. Where does it come from?
I don't know, the engineering of this class, this new class of people as a result of a scientific breakthrough, unnamed scientific breakthrough, is full dehumanization, but without realizing that what the attempted dehumanization results in actual humans. And so, the full circle of the headmistress and Madame revealing that they weren't running, well, they sort of were running this sort of totalitarian regime where they were in full control of the children, of the donors. But in the end, what they were actually trying to do is work out, are they human? Can they be freed? Do they deserve rights? And what you find out towards the end of the film is that that was an experiment conducted by this fully authoritarian government, which is never mentioned, but is assumed to exist, who conclude that the experiment is not worth conducting. And they sort of very, very subtly allude to the shutting down of the schools and the replacement with factory farming
Yeah, battery farms.
of presumably of humans. So the thing you just mentioned, the complexity, and I think the real interest in this is just this absolute compliance of a full dehumanization process, which has somehow been fully integrated into what looks like a very recognizable society if you grew up in East Anglia in the 70s and 80s. But, the Union Jack was flying at the end there. I sort of wonder, I think listening to all of your other programs, I found myself for the first time watching this and thinking, I wonder what Orwell would have made of this world, the film and the book. Because it feels like love is the ultimate subversive act, whereas sex is the ultimate subversive act in 1984. But ultimately, it's fully doomed for them.
The other thing about the implied cloning, it's just hints. We're just given glimpses of the society that lies behind the society that we see. But there's that whole strand of the plot which is looking for the possibles, the originals, and the assumption that they have in it maybe a myth. They are fed all sorts of myths, that they were taken from or modeled on people in the gutter, as Ruth says. It's junkies and prostitutes and so on. And then she's looking through the porno magazines because she's looking for her original. That's so odd and haunting in its way. It's a eugenics society, but it's an anti-eugenics program in the sense that we're not trying to create better people or strip out the bad people. We are taking the people that we think are less than us and just using them for their organs.
Right. So it's the commodification of humans. It is a thing that we think about. Well, I think about quite a lot in relation to eugenics, which is an area that as you know, I study. But also the very real notion of donors, which is a noble act and should be encouraged, even to the extent that there are examples of donor siblings, so people who have been conceived in order to donate their organs to siblings that have known genetic diseases, which again is a good thing to do, a self-sacrificial thing to do, but always done by choice, right? Because those are people who want to donate, who want to improve the lives of others. Whereas the class of people that have been created from the 1950s onwards in this world, they have no choice. We realize through the course of the narrative that they have all the urges of normal humans, of non-cloned humans, but also at the same time, they appear to have almost no free will. So they have total freedom, as you say. They buzz in and out of their houses and they drive to cafes and look bewildered by normal life. But they always go back.
There's no resistance
No.
at all.
And Tommy is the only one who shows this the most human characteristic of all, which is this incredible, utterly justified frustration, both as a child when he freaks out when he doesn't get picked, when he gets picked last for the sports team or not at all. And then ultimately when he finds out that the rumors and the promises will not be fulfilled and he will complete and he will die. And Carrie Mulligan's character, Kathy H, the tragedy is so embedded in her role. And, it should be said, I think, I don't know whether you agree with this, but I think that is an astonishing performance by her. She has the most emotive face where she's almost smiling. And with that, all the way through, showing her absolute complicity in this process when she watches the man who she's loved since she was a child completing, because that's the way it is.
Just to go back to what you said earlier, when you say the difference between our world and that world is that in our world it's always by choice. But the conception, even in our world, is not by choice. If you have been conceived to be a donor, and there is always moral pressure allows for free choice in some ways and in some ways doesn't if you are a sibling donor. It's not black and white, is it?
No, no, I think that's a very fair observation. I suppose that the fiction and the speculative fiction, stroke science fiction element of it is to just take that to an extreme. That I think is a thing that science fiction does well in terms of the taking a single idea and twisting the dial on it. Just change that and say that
Yeah.
this is what the world looks like in 10 minutes time or 10 years time, or if it started in the 1950s. And I think that that is one of the conceits that is a core part of what gets called science fiction or speculative fiction if you're Margaret Atwood, in order to distinguish yourself from bad writing, which I don't think is entirely fair. But that idea that the full compliance and complicity, and there is no choice, they appear to have no free will whatsoever, but willingly so. And that again, I think, is the theme that these people are. There isn't a word for them, but they are slaves. They are slaves to an authoritarian government, which doesn't seem to display any other aspects of authoritarianism in that world other than the total commodification of a type of human being that previously did not exist.
And that is one of the things that makes it so eerie, that seaside town. You know that Morrissey song,
Yes,
"Every Day is Like
I
Sunday"?
do. That was the first 7-inch I bought.
Right, the seaside town they forgot to close down,
Yeah.
"Come, come nuclear bombs,"
Yeah.
that one.
The problem with referring to Morrissey doing that stuff in the 1980s and 90s is that it turns out it wasn't ironic and he is actually a fascist. But yes.
But the bleakness of that vision of that town, everything that we see, the little look into the travel agency when they're looking for her original, the cafe, Madame doing her gardening outside, the glimpse inside the interiors. It's a society in which there are these donors who are living their separate life, and everything else is seemingly unconstrained in the sense that it's not a fascist coercive state. And yet everybody is complying with this misery.
But isn't that why it's so problematic and disturbing? Because how does a society sleepwalk into that situation? I was thinking about this in terms of stuff you talk about a lot, which is the commodification of us through the use of the internet. This notion that rather than being customers, we're actually the products. And if we don't own the thing that we're buying, we are actually not even volunteering, but paying to be commoditized, and most people are completely unaware of that, or maybe increasingly aware of it as time progresses. But that idea that we've walked into that situation, I think, is somewhat reflected in this film, in this notion that no one in society outside of the people that we know seems to be even slightly bothered by it.
Yeah.
The one teacher, Sally Hawkins's character, Miss Lucy, who shows any sort of resistance to this as an idea, is fully disappeared overnight. Right, the only act of rebellion that one sees in this film, apart from Tommy losing his shit a couple of times, and that's it, is through Miss Lucy, and the response to her actions are authoritarian. She is disappeared by the headmistress, who is, appears to be authoritarian and totalitarian, but in the end was trying to work out whether they were.
And yet when she disappears Miss Lucy, she gives that speech to the
Yeah,
kids, which is the bit where the school feels most like a kind of fascist
they all clap.
camp, because they clap her as she starts more or less telling them that she's doing it for them, and we know,
Yeah, I will
and
not
they
be
know.
coerced, she
Yeah.
says, and they applaud.
I want to get on to the bit of this conversation, which is the bit that I'm keenest to talk about, which is not the science fiction, But the suggestion at the end, which I think most people watching it along the way get a feel of, and they're not sure. Certainly, the first time I saw it, I found myself thinking, "Am I meant to be thinking this? Am I not meant to be thinking this?" Which is that actually it's an allegory. And at the very end, the thought that are the lives of these people, the donors, so different from the lives of the people for whom they are donating? We all complete. We are all in some ways donors of one kind or another, or at least, most people, morality would encourage us to try to be. And as one goes back through the film, but particularly I think back to Hailsham, to feel that this is an allegory about education. So when I watched the film, partly because of the name Hailsham, it made me think of there's a school called Haileybury, which is a sort of grand English public school that was created by the East India Company to train young men to go out and trade and rule the world. And then it became the training college for the empire, an imperial training college. And then it became a military training college. And its most famous former pupil is Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister. And as I was watching this, I thought Hailsham in 1978 is a bit like Haileybury in 1914, teaching these boys to, I don't know if they taught them art, but they would have taught them to keep their bodies healthy. Some of the language, that classic language of sort of English imperial public school, healthy body, healthy mind, you have a duty, in order to send them out to be massacred on the Western Front. And the lie at the heart of that whole vision of education, which is we're creating the full person, we're creating the complete human being, but only because we're going to use you, and indeed we're going to destroy you. And that's part of what makes this film so haunting. You don't have to be a donor to, at various points in the human experience, feel like the whole thing is set up to persuade you that it's worth doing. But in the end, it's not.
Which it does for most people, but then underneath that, there are all these. I think one of the most powerful ideas in that is that they are fed all of these lies, and there are all these rumors which say, well, we might be able to get out of this,
They,
which I think is very much part of that model as well. If we just do this very human thing, in the case of the film and the book, fall in love to demonstrate that we are artistic
fall in love and mean it.
and mean it. Yes. Isn't it so tragic the way he says when they finally meet Madame and say, the first thing he says is, we're in love and it's real.
And he says it's
It's
verifiable.
verifiable.
And she says,
Oh,
verifiable?
yeah. Is it not also very much about class, in that it is the construction and maintenance of a class system, which is what authoritarian regimes want, which is full compliance, a class which is very happy to be in exactly their station and incapable biologically, because they seem to be somehow biologically coded to be fully complicit and not to want to break out of it. But the creation of a class which is very content to serve without questioning, and to serve, with the ultimate sacrifice very quickly. They die young. That whole conversation they have at the beginning, which is, well, what happens to children? It's Sally Hawkins again who says that no one knows what happens to children. We do know what happens is they grow up. They grow up and we become adults, and because we have free will, and our lives are not predestined. But that's not what will happen to you. You will not become adults. You will complete. The euphemisms are very powerful. You will
Yeah.
complete.
And for the reason you say, the Haileybury analogy is probably not right in the sense. So I found myself thinking of the slaughter on the Western Front, what it would be to educate a child, knowing that you were sending this child as soon as this child was 18 to a death for a higher cause. And all of that education was for nothing. I remember reading about, I think this man was the star graduate of West Point or one of those American military academies, and they'd spent 2 years training up the perfect soldier and giving him all the qualities that you need, leadership and all the rest. And then they sent him to the beaches in Normandy, and before the thing came down on his landing craft, bullet through the head. And it has that feel to it. But as you say, if you think it's about class, it's not the Haileyburys of this world that we're talking about here. It's everyone else. After all, go to Haileybury and you're Clement Attlee, who was on the beaches at Gallipoli, and you survive the First World War, you end up as Prime Minister. It's everybody else who has been conditioned to lead a life of sacrifice for a higher social cause in which there is no out.
Right, and the disdain, I'd never really noticed this before, but the disdain that the class that is apparently, because it's not, it's very, it's a film which is not very explicit. It doesn't tell you what's happening very much, but I think it does it very skillfully. But the class which I presume is just above them, which is a working class, the men mending the engine on the Ford Transit van, and the men who bring the boxes,
The veg boxes as well, and the boxes of
the
toys,
boxes of junk,
discarded, yeah,
just
junk.
stuff that they are so excited about, and it's broken toys and old tapes. But those men, when on that first scene when the sale has been announced and they're bringing those boxes in, and they say it's going to be, what's the word they use? It's going to be
Bumper crop.
a bumper crop. And those men bringing those boxes in look at the kids like they're freaks. You know, they're looking at them in such a disdainful way, like, what are these creatures? Madame says creature at the end, and I feel like that is probably a very deliberate use of that word, although it's not in the same, she's using it in an affection, a sort of affectionate way. But the way that those men, those very obviously styled as working class men in overalls, are carrying in those boxes and looking at those kids who look really normal. They look like kids at normal school, but they look at them like they are weirdos, which I suppose is what they are. But the notion that this is a society which is so well structured with no social mobility in it, and you've got these new creations which ultimately we find out they haven't decided whether they're human or not at the stage when they're growing up, but they are below the next tier and they're all subservient to what is on top, and we don't know what that is.
There is that weird and really striking moment when the Carey Mulligan character says, "I want to be a carer," and she says it to the guy driving the van, and you look at it and you think, why is she saying it to him? And he's gonna give a gruff response because he, as you say, has contempt, and he says, "I'll bring in the form tomorrow." So he's the person who has the forms. It's like there's a world beyond this world which we don't see. That's why it's so odd that the glimpses of the world that we do see are so familiar, because you feel, where is the real power? Where is the real action in this society? It's not happening on the Norfolk coast. So where is it? But we just see those two bottom levels
And
interact.
it's a very eugenicsy styling of that idea that there are stations in life which are biologically encoded, this hereditarian idea that there is no social mobility because our position in life is determined by our biology. And as you say, we only see the bottom two tiers, but there are many tiers above that, apparently under the Union flag, in which this world exists, and everyone's quite content with it. Even as you point out, to the extent that the elderly couple who look a bit rough around the edges in a Norfolk coastal cafe look at those slightly unrealistic. They look at Keira Knightley, Carey Mulligan, and Andrew Garfield and think they're not astonishingly attractive people. But that is part of the complicity. It's that they are below slavery.
But their astonishing attractiveness, it's also part of it in the sense that it's in that tradition, and it's more like sci-fi in that respect. They are otherworldly. They do look like they come from a different species, and they have, after all, been created for their bodies. They haven't been created for their minds. They haven't been created for their souls. They've been created for their bodies, and they may have been created from people who, from one perspective, are from the gutter, but from another perspective may have been the beautiful ones. So they have that alien quality to them. I mean, I think it's one of the things that makes the film so effective. The three leads all look a little bit like they might come from another world. You could say the theme of this film is that it is about a society in which some creatures have been brought into being that are human-like, but not fully human. I mean, it's extraordinary that at the end, when the headmistress says to them, "Nearly human, almost human like you," and they've been so human throughout. These human-like creatures have been created to be a means and not to be an end. So in Kantian philosophy, the distinguishing characteristic of being human is that you are an end and you are not a means to an end. And these entities, whatever they are means and not ends. And they are accepting of their fate. They try a little bit to break out of it. Falling in love would make you an end and not a means. You would be someone else's end, but no, it's not enough. That is presumably always a danger of science, the creation of things, living or not living things, that are a means and not an end. Does this film, beyond its setup, speak to you of a danger in how we understand scientific progress?
Ever present. And there's another film, Jurassic Park, which
Which
it's not a film that I adore, but it does have a very good philosophy of science ethic within it. In those iconic speeches by Jeff Goldblum, when he says things like, "Your scientists didn't stop to think whether they should do something rather than whether they
they could,
could,"
yeah.
which is a perpetual conversation that we don't have enough in science. And my role as an academic is in the space between primary research and public understanding, and when it becomes policy. And the bit that's almost always missing, or more frequently in the modern era, is tagged on at the end because you have to deal with ethics and philosophy in order to get the grant, but is stapled on because we've already thought of this is the project that we want to do, and oh, we also need to deal with the ethics. So it's often the last thing which is tagged on.
So it's like, we can do it,
Yeah,
and then we'll think about whether we should do it.
right. And again, I will piss off a lot of my colleagues by saying this, but you can go through our entire career as a very successful scientist and never once have any formal education, training, or understanding even of the philosophy of science or of any basic ethics, or the thousands of years worth of thought that has gone into the question of could versus should, which is captured in that one moment in Jurassic Park, right? Which is a warning, right? That is a I've never understood why there are so many sequels to, to that film, because the conclusion was this was an error, right? So in Jurassic Park, you see that process unfolding in front of you. You see the disaster because we have chosen this path for whatever reasons, commercial reasons primarily, and decided that we're going to do it rather than not do it, not consider the ethics. This is a film which is set 50 years after that decision was taken. And there wasn't the discussion about the ethics, or it happened and we never see it, but it doesn't figure into the decision goes the way that we have seen the world unfold.
And as the headmistress says, try telling people now that we're going to go back.
Right,
They won't accept it.
right. Now,
We're
when
not going to bring back lung cancer.
and that's exactly so. When I study, so my two areas of the history of science that I specialize in are the history of scientific racism and the history of eugenics, right? And in both cases, they are the emergence of a science that comes from a political ideology where that conversation did not happen. And the science, the sort of justificatory logic that goes into turning an ideology into an institutionalized practice, and then ultimately in Nazi Germany, genocide, or in America, the enforced sterilization of hundreds of thousands of people, is that at no point did someone say at the beginning, the science isn't actually good enough here to answer the question that we're trying to answer. Can we do this or should we do this? And that question in both of those cases is, yeah, it's deciding to make the dinosaurs or make the clones without considering the ethical framework. In both cases as well, it's heavily class mediated as well. Eugenics was, in this country more than in America, was a class-based decision. It was that these are people who don't deserve reproductive rights, and therefore the best way to deal with that is not through social means, but through the control of reproductive rights. Now, we never had that as policy as a result of the campaigning of one MP, Josiah Wedgwood, and one writer, G.K. Chesterton. But in America and in 30 countries around the world, that conversation went in a different direction, and the result was one of the sort of pillars of, a central ideology in 20th century global politics, which was eugenics. But at the root of it was that there was never the question, should we do this? Or what is the ethical and philosophical consequences of the path that we've set ourselves on? Because the ideology is more important than what the science or the ethics can tell us at this point. This is a film set in the long aftermath of that decision going one way.
Although, as I say, it's not a eugenics scenario here, in the sense that it's not, we can, so we should not allow these people to reproduce. This is, we can, so we should create things that wouldn't otherwise exist, which we are going to use as means and not ends.
Right, but we don't know who the recipients of the donors are.
Maybe it doesn't reach the Norfolk coast.
Well,
that's
what
why
I
they
was-
look so grim
See,
in that
that's
cafe.
what I wondered. That when for the first time, I wondered whether the disdain that the next tier working classes have for the
If they don't get the organ.
as you're looking at these weird creatures as they're referred to, and actually their organs are going to go to some people
To
that aren't-
London.
yeah, some people that we are unaware of, the posh people, the rich people.
Andy Burnham would sort that out. This film, to see it in 2026, it feels a little different to me, in the sense that as we get to the end, and when we get that scene where they go to ask for their deferral and they're told there are no deferrals. And they are told bluntly, "We were curious about human-like creatures like you. We made you do art, not to sort of show who should be deferred and who shouldn't be deferred, but to try and work out what you were." It feels a little different in the age of, I don't know if AI is the term for it, but we are entering a world where we are going to be building human-like things, which will be able to do art. They may not be embodied, but the robots are coming too. You look at the videos coming out of China, and at some point, the physical and the software are going to come together, and people are going to start asking these questions, not reproductive questions, not organ donation questions, but still questions about how we treat these things that we are going to be building. I mean, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that we're going to be building human-like things that, at least for some people, will raise the questions whether we should treat them as though they were actually human. So it feels to me in 2026, this film reads a little differently, and maybe the novel that underlies it reads a little differently.
I think that there is a biological version of that before you get to the AI, which I do think is a very valid point. But the conversations that we've had over the years, first about using animals, animal organs, or fusing animal cells with other animal cells or with other human cells, we are animals. Those conversations have been happening since the 18th century when those things are first attempted. And
Feels there that the should does have more of a say, doesn't it?
well, Jeremy Bentham would disagree with you, and the whole debate at that time about the utility of animals, the most consequential argument of that time was between Descartes and Bentham, and the utilitarian argument that emerges from that. Can they feel pain rather than are they sentient? And all, there's a long history in that, which by the 20th century turns into, well, now we're doing it anyway. So we are using animals. There's, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the legal acts that prevent deliberately inflicted pain on animals. This is in the UK specifically. And then into the middle of the 20th century, where we began creating hybrids and taking genetic elements from one organism and putting it in another. And now we're at a stage where the many attempts to replace human organs, faulty human organs, with animals never really worked. Xenotransplantation has been a sort of exotic side cul-de-sac, a little bit of a cul-de-sac in the history of biological research, but was and continues to be an active area of research, always looking for new alternatives for dealing with biological, treating people and treating diseases. We're now at a stage where one of the biggest problems in creating tissue is that we tend to grow it in flat petri dishes. So it's flat, and we are three-dimensional objects, and we've found it really hard over the years to model three-dimensional organs rather than the flat ones that grow in cell cultures. But we're getting to a point where we're growing what are called organoids. So they are like clusters. You can take a sort of globular bit of brain, you can grow a globular bit of brain. And from a scientific point of view, it's important because we can see neural networks across a three-dimensional structure, and so on, right? So we're constantly progressing towards creating more realistic, more biologically naturalistic versions of tissue, so we can test them, so we can do science on them, so we can use them to replace faulty organs in humans. Now, at every stage of that process, I don't think I've described anything there which most people wouldn't find totally acceptable and could be justified in scientific and
Apart
ethical
probably
terms.
from the animal to human thing, which a lot of people don't like.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And the church has always resisted a lot of those. Well, I think the church is not one thing, but there's often been religious resistance to that. So I do think there is a lot of biological. There is, although you're asking a question about non-embodied but human-like conscious
Yeah.
behavior, I think there's still quite a lot of biological processes which feed into the ideas in the film itself. I mean, I think another film which deals with the question that you're asking is another Alex Garland film, which is Ex Machina. I can't remember how you feel about that as a film, but
Well, I know that you worked on
I
it.
did work on it, so I'm not neutral. There is a film which is about the
Yeah.
embodiment of human-like consciousness and what it does when you give conscious. I don't think there's a better analysis of AI than a film that came out 10 years before that, or 11 years old now, but before most of those companies even existed. The crazy thing is that when we start, this is a bit of inside baseball about working on that film. In making that film, which I helped out
Ex
on,
Machina.
Ex Machina, I saw it very clearly as another. This is a question of morality, and this is possibly a warning, and there's some complex ideas and philosophical ideas in there. I think a lot of people, men in Silicon Valley, watched that film.
And thought, cool,
Yes.
she looks hot.
Yes. I
If you've
honestly
seen,
think
if you haven't seen the film, you can just imagine what we're talking
I
about.
honestly think that's true. I think we witnessed some of it when, during the promotion period, it was being screened at large tech companies in Silicon Valley, because there was this notion that we want to get these people interested in this film because they're the ones doing it. But I think a lot of them saw it. I don't know how familiar the audience is with the film, but it's basically a three-hander where you've got a coder who gets duped into testing a humanoid robot who's been created by a very clearly Mark Zuckerberg stroke Elon Musk stroke the Google fella's character. And I think a lot of them saw the man who's clearly the antagonist. He's not morally sound.
Yeah.
And I think they saw that and went, yes, I want to be like that guy.
And not like that guy who's saying, are you sure we should be doing this?
Yes. Yeah. It's a weird situation to have been involved in a film which a lot of people seem to think was a guidebook rather than a warning.
One of the great things about this film is I'd be amazed if anyone looked at this film and thought, cool.
I'm going to disagree with Adam because I like taxonomies and putting things in boxes. So here's what the film's I think's about. It's a depiction of what a truly utilitarian society would have to look like, where basically if the majority, the greatest number, need the organs, they get the organs. So that's at one level, but how would you make that function? You'd need to have a sub-slave class who are completely compliant, but you would also need systematic dishonesty. You look them in the face and tell them they're not even human. They're so clearly human. You have to tell them lies like, oh, you don't have souls, or we wanted to see if you had souls. But this is a lie that the people who are not the donors tell in order to be able to live with the fact that they're exploiting them. So I think it's a depiction of a truly utilitarian society. And I didn't actually come up with that idea. I came up with it because twice, at least in my life, I've met people who said, I was a utilitarian in my early 20s, and then I read Never Let Me Go. And it made me realize that was completely the wrong way to look at the world.
That's so interesting. I'm going to have to think about that, but I don't. That's a very persuasive argument. I also think it points out the folly of utilitarian calculations because it's a 3-to-1 ratio. If everyone completes on 2 or 3 or maybe 4, then if the calculation is how many people have to die in order for a greater number of people to be saved, then according to this model, the answer is 3-to-1.
The other thing that's interesting about that is there's that version of utilitarianism which is called government house utilitarianism, which is weirdly associated with places like Haileybury, where you go out and you conquer the world. And the key to having a utilitarian outlook is that you mustn't tell the society that you're ruling that you're utilitarians. That's the only way it can work. And it's a dystopian. It's usually the term that's used for utilitarianism gone wrong.
Hi, thanks for that. So I'd read the book a long time ago and hadn't seen the film, and then actually looking at it in a sort of 2026 frame of mind, obviously wouldn't have been at all the intention of Ishiguro, but I was sort of thinking of that dehumanization that I feel is coming across so much more in sort of language, Standard Chartered guide talking about lower value human capital, Sam Altman talking about defending data centers, energy use by saying, well, humans quite expensive energy-wise to raise. And Peter Thiel, obviously, who thinks there's no point in humanity anymore. So I just thought of that as an analogy, but something you came back to quite a lot in your discussion about it was, why were they so complicit? But actually with that convenience and things that are actually quite easy, all the scraping of human knowledge that's gone into these AI systems, and everyone's just kind of like, well, I get quite good ideas from ChatGPT, and that sort of, if it's convenient and it's a good result, I don't see any pushback from that. And so I was just quite surprised that you were surprised by their complicity that you see in the film as well.
Because you think we're complicit like they are.
I think society as a whole is, and I think it's hard not to. I'm not like, I can't say I'm doing an amazing job.
When I say we, I mean we.
Yeah, I think so.
We
Yeah.
humans.
Yeah.
But our complicity, as you just said, we are distracted because there is a product that we think we value, and that makes us complicit because we're distracted by, well, you don't look over here at what we're actually doing. Here's a thing which is, answers your questions on ChatGPT or its products that you can actually use. I think the difference is, and this is my response to your question, which I think is very good, is they don't get anything. Their existence is awful. They get pushed around, they're bullied at school in a terrible, English public school, and they don't appear to have a joyous life at all. They're not sold anything on top of that. So I think it's a great observation, but the complicity, I suppose is genetically encoded. I don't want to speculate too much on what the origin story of these people, but they appear to just accept it.
Do you think the thing that they get is innocence until the innocence is destroyed? But that school experience, so there's stories at the beginning where don't go beyond the gates because this is what happened to the boy, this is what happened to the girl. And there's a kind of fantasy element to their lives. They're happy with their tokens, they're happy with the bumper crop. It's the innocence of childhood.
Well, they appear
Which
to have
is, it's that vision that people sometimes have. Couldn't it be the 1950s again when children were protected from all the bad stuff out there? Isn't that what they're being offered?
Well, possibly, but they appear to have no curiosity. If the question was, and maybe this was, we're speculating about a backstory to this that is not explicit at all, not even examined it, but is the backstory that the question is that they are asking, the authorities are asking, are these creatures human? Because they appear to have total complicity. May have succeeded in engineering people that are not human because they have no curiosity or they have no desire to.
So let's look at their art.
Yes, they don't appear to want to rebel. And Tommy, who at the end says, I was messed up, who appears to have very normal human characteristics as an 8-year-old, but is perceived as being weird and odd and possibly, I don't know, neurodivergent, we might say today, but at the time is fully complicit in, he's the most human character out of any of them.
And there presumably will come a point where they will want to look at our art to see if we really care anymore, or we're happy to let ChatGPT do it.
Just going off your point about class and caste, there's a P.D. James book, Children of Men, where there's no new babies and the society's getting older. And in the book, anyway, they bring in lots of immigrants to act as carers in that society, in that dystopia. And then you were talking about the men in overalls that we do see. There's one other working class man that we see just at the end, and he's the Black British carer of Miss Emily. I think he's called George. And so part of what perhaps we're seeing is a sort of act of care, a commoditized act of care by a caste of people. Caring for people through voluntarily giving up your organs is one thing, and voluntarily caring for people we love is another. And getting others and paying them to care for others is perhaps something that's also going on in this film.
So it's the thing that we didn't talk about, so the various categories, but after all, the carer is one of the central categories in this film. At the end, when she says, and I finished my time as a carer, so now I'm going to become a donor, which is one of the many heartbreaking moments in the film.
The carer class is another act of absolute complicity, isn't it, though, that even within this totally complicit, compliant group of people, there are ones that reinforce that. And she looks on benevolently and feels a little bit of remorse and sadness. It's 2 weeks since the language I thought was very important and that last line when she says, it's 2 weeks since I lost Tommy. Whereas every other point talking about death, the euphemism is completion, as it is a predestined act. You complete because everyone completes at the end. So there's only one moment, I think, where there is a sense of actual loss.
And there is also the bit earlier on where she says, I think I'm quite a good carer because I've got used to it. And we see her filling in the form. And being a good carer is not getting too distressed and not allowing the people that you care for to get too distressed as their organs are harvested.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's worth mentioning Carey Mulligan's performance in conveying the subtleties and the emotional engagement for that, where if you were not in this complicit, compliant class, you'd be saying, no, this is a terrible situation we're in. And you can almost see it in her face. And then she reverts to absolute subservience to whatever the model that she's part of.
And the film begins and ends with her looking at the Andrew Garfield character and watching him die, effectively.
I was just wondering whether we live in a world where this is scientifically possible now. And if so, whether 20 years ago when the book was written, it was completely dystopian, or whether it was on the horizon back then.
No, it's not. I mean, the thing about cloning, which was a really important sort of science fiction trope for much of the 20th century, and you've just done Brave New World, right?
Yeah.
In political fictions. It just turned out to be much harder than we thought for two reasons. One is it's really difficult to do. So everyone remembers Dolly the sheep, right? So Dolly was the first cloned mammal. That's not true. She was not the first. She wasn't even the first cloned sheep, but she was the first cloned mammal from a particular type of cell. Side note, awful side note. The reason she was called Dolly was because that the cell that she was cloned from came from the mammary gland of her mother. And so she's actually named after Dolly Parton because scientists are awful. What most people don't know is that Dolly was the 297th attempt, of which almost all didn't make it, weren't fertilized or didn't make it to implantation. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but Dolly was the first that lived. So in terms of it being an extremely costly process in terms of how many organisms, how many animals you need to try and create in order to get one that lives. Right? Now, what followed, that was in 1997, and what followed was a short boom in trying to clone other animals, of which there were plenty, but it sort of turned out to be a scientific dead end because of the same reasons, because it was not very efficient, took many, many organisms to create one successful one. There was a brief period where people started cloning pets and then were really pissed off that the pets didn't behave like the original pets. At which point, every geneticist on Earth went, yeah, well, I could have predicted that with 100% certainty, because that's not how genetics works. The first cat cloned was called Copycat, which is quite cute. But cloning just didn't turn out to be the thing that science fiction had thought it would be, because it turns out genetics is much more complex than we had thought. So we can't clone humans. We won't be able to clone humans probably ever. That's probably a foolish thing to say. I think it's a really useful historical science fiction trope, whilst not really being it didn't turn out the way that the science fiction authors thought it might do.
That was the last from this series of episodes recorded at the Regent Street Cinema in London. Many thanks to them for hosting us. A reminder that the second part of my conversation with Robert Saunders on the 10th anniversary of the Brexit referendum, telling the story from 2016 to 2026, is available now on PPF Plus. If you would like to hear it and get all of our bonus episodes, there'll be more than 50 waiting for you, and going forward 2 every month, plus ad-free listening, plus automatic sign-up to our fortnightly newsletter. Just click on the link in the show description or go to ppfideas.com. It's £5 a month or £50 for the year. We would love to have you join us. Coming up soon, we've got a new set of episodes in the strand that we call The History of Bad Ideas. You may remember some of the ones that we've done before on ideas ranging from anti-Semitism to VAR technology in football. Some of the bad ideas we've got coming up include hysteria, short-form video, the Electoral College, and many, many more. But before that, it's a pair of episodes in our series Where Are We Going? 2 conversations with the Bulgarian writer and political theorist Ivan Krastev, talking about the idea of the future, the role it plays in our imaginations, and how it is changing. 2 conversations about the past, present, and future of the future. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.